John Bunyan, probably most well known for his book, The Pilgrim's Progress. But who was he? And why did he write this infamous book? Well, just to give you a bit of context, when was he living? He was living in England during the time when Oliver Cromwell was around. The Great Plague had happened, many thousands died, the Great Fire of London. Royal Mail started delivering. So we're talking the 17th century. He grew up in quite a poor household. Life was not easy. Bit of a rebel. He went to church, yeah, but it kind of stopped there. And he had a bit of a reputation. But he was aware something wasn't right, and it niggled him. And it kept on niggling him, and to the point that he had an experience with God, and God kind of spoke directly to him. And this unsettled him. And to the point that he then actually began to read his Bible in a way that he'd never read it before, the book. And he began pleading with God actually to show him what was right. Questioning, was he really a Christian? And he began to slowly understand that God was saying to him and was speaking to him through the Bible. And at last he realised the crucial thing, that he needed forgiveness. He needed Christ to forgive his sins and his wrongdoings. And the change in his life was amazing. It really was incredible, and he started hungering after the Word of God, and to the point he started to share it and to preach it, and people realised that he had a gift of preaching, and he preached for 4 years. And then the laws in England changed, incredibly enough, and there was an Act of Parliament that was kind of telling people how to share the Word of God, how to preach, and he was not for that. He said he wanted to preach it freely and honestly, and so he was put in prison, and he was put in prison for 11 years. It's fascinating when you start to read the story there. And he used his time in prison, and he wrote many different things, but the big famous one was this one called The Pilgrim's Progress. And interestingly enough, even 200 years after his death, most households in England would have a copy of the Bible and a copy of this, The Pilgrim's Progress. And that leads me to this wee copy here, which is the copy that my mum had, and she read it to my brothers and I when we were young. So this is the children's version. It's the version that I'm going to share with you, much easier to understand from the old language. And it starts like this. Little Christian lived in a great city called Destruction. Its streets were full of boys and girls who laughed and played all day long. This was in the summertime, when the sun was shining and the city looked bright and pleasant. On the rainy days in winter, the children didn't feel so happy, and they would sometimes be glad to sit down quietly and listen to stories. People would come and visit the city of Destruction, and they would say, "There's a beautiful country far away from this city. A very good and wise king rules over it, who loves little children dearly. The prince to whom your city belongs is wicked and cruel, and he hates our good king. But one day an army will come from the king's country to fight against your prince, and this city will be burned and all the people in it will be killed." Then the children asked, "What will become of us?" The strangers always answered, "You must leave this city now, while you're young and strong, and travel to the king's country. In the celestial city where he lives, you will be quite safe." Little Christian heard this many times, and he often thought about it. But whenever he said to his friends, "Shall we go to the celestial city?" they just laughed at him and told him that it was all make-believe, this story about the king, and that the city could be no better or safer than their own. But little Christian felt quite sure the strangers had spoken the truth. And one day he found an old book, and he opened the book and started to read it. And in there, in that book, were written the very same things about the king and the celestial city, and their own wicked prince and his city, which would certainly be burned when the king came. And he showed his book to his friends, but they laughed all the more and said, "Oh, that book was written hundreds of years ago. It's of no use now. The king's army has never come, and very likely it never will." But this bothered little Christian, and he went home thinking about it that night.